The Great Salt Lake sits at the edge of the Utah desert like a mirror that has forgotten how to reflect. In the summer of 2001, its surface was flat and blinding, the air above it thick with the smell of brine and heat, and the particular silence that exists only in places where something terrible has already happened, but no one yet knows it. The mountains to the east cast long shadows each morning across the valley towns, shadows that stretch slowly across rooftops and schoolyards and quiet suburban streets, where sprinklers ran on timers and garage doors opened at predictable hours. It was, by any reasonable measure, an ordinary part of the American West, a place where people went to church on Sundays, coached Little League, and believed with the comfortable certainty of the faithful that they knew their neighbors well. On the morning of July 24th, 2001, a pioneer day in Utah, a holiday that fills the state with parades and fireworks, and the particular pride of a community that believes in its own founding myth. A woman named Lori Ann Tanner did not come downstairs. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair that she kept pulled back in a loose braid when she was working in the garden, and blue-gray eyes that her sister Deborah described years later as the kind of eyes that made you feel like she already knew what you were going to say. She had 2 children, a daughter named Caitlin, age 7, and a son named Marcus, age 4. She lived in a pale yellow house on Ridgecrest Avenue in the town of Cedar Valley, roughly 40 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, a town of fewer than 2,000 people in 2001, where the post office doubled as a community gathering point, and the local school was the kind of place where teachers remembered your parents' names. Her husband was Douglas Tanner, 34, a building contractor who drove a white Ford pickup and was known around town as a man of few words and firm opinions. He coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings. He sat in the same pew every Sunday. He waved to neighbors from the driveway. Clears throat. On the morning of July 24, 2001, Douglas Tanner called 911 at 6:47 in the morning to report that his wife was missing. He said she had not been in the bed when he woke. He said her car was still in the driveway. He said he did not know where she was. Cedar Valley in the summer was a particular kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Children played in sprinkler water in front yards. Screen doors slapped shut. Dogs lay on porches with their chins on the wooden boards, watching the heat shimmer rise off the asphalt. The town had a single main street with a hardware store, a diner called Paulette's, a pharmacy, and a post office with a bulletin board that still used thumbtacks. The nearest hospital was a 37-minute drive. The nearest city felt like another world. The Tanner house on Ridgecrest Avenue was a 3-bedroom, 1-story pale yellow home with a white front porch and a garden along the left side where Lori grew tomatoes, basil, and a row of sunflowers that her daughter Caitlin had planted from seed the previous spring. The sunflowers had just come into bloom that July. They faced east, the way sunflowers do, and on the morning of July 24th, they turned toward the rising sun as they always had, indifferent to the crisis beginning to form behind the pale yellow walls. The day before, July 23rd, a Monday, had been, by all accounts, unremarkable. Lori had taken Caitlin and Marcus to the community pool in the afternoon, a trip confirmed later by at least 3 separate neighbors who saw them walking down the street at approximately 2:15 p.m. She had stopped at the pharmacy on the way home to pick up children's cold medicine for Marcus, who had a mild summer cough. She paid cash. The receipt, recovered later, was time-stamped 4:38 p.m. That evening, neighbors recalled seeing the lights on in the Tanner living room. A neighbor directly across the street, Patricia Hallbrook, 62, a retired school librarian who had lived on Ridgecrest Avenue for 31 years, later told investigators that she had noticed the Tanner porch light was still on at 6:30 p.m. when she let her cat inside for the night. Unusual, she noted, because Lori typically turned it off after dark. It was a small thing. The kind of thing you notice, and then immediately decide means nothing. The children went to bed at their normal time. Douglas Tanner later stated that he and Lori watched television in the living room until approximately 9:45 p.m., at which point Lori said she was tired and went to bed. He stated that he stayed up another 45 minutes, then went to bed himself. He stated that he did not hear anything in the night. He stated that when he woke at 6:30 a.m., she was gone. He called 911 at 6:47 a.m. The dispatcher's log recorded his voice as calm. Cedar Valley Sheriff's Department deputies arrived at 7:12 a.m. They found Douglas Tanner standing on the front porch in jeans and a gray t-shirt, arms crossed, watching the road. Inside, Caitlin and Marcus were still asleep. The bed in the master bedroom was neatly made, the pillows arranged, the blankets smoothed. Lori's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her wallet was inside. Her driver's license was inside. Her car keys were hanging on the hook by the garage door. Her shoes, both pairs that she kept by the front door, were there. Deputy Carl Whitmore, who was first on scene and filed the initial report, noted in his documentation, subject's personal effects including identification, vehicle, and footwear all present at residence. No signs of forced entry or disturbance. The deputy asked Douglas Tanner, had there been an argument? Douglas Tanner said no. Had there been any problems in the marriage? Douglas Tanner said no. Was there anywhere Lori might have gone on foot in the early morning without her shoes? Douglas Tanner looked at the road and said he couldn't think of anywhere. Caitlin woke up at 7:45. She came into the living room in her pajamas with the pattern of small yellow ducks. She looked at the deputies and asked where her mother was. Douglas Tanner picked her up and told her that Mommy had gone for a walk and would be back soon. Marcus woke up at 8:10. He sat on the couch with his stuffed rabbit and watched cartoons, unaware. By 9:00 a.m., the search had begun. The search for Lori Ann Tanner was, by rural Utah standards in the summer of 2001, a substantial operation. Within 24 hours of the initial call, Cedar Valley Sheriff's Department had requested assistance from the Tooele County Sheriff's Office, the Utah Department of Public Safety, and a volunteer search and rescue team out of Salt Lake City that specialized in wilderness recovery. By the morning of July 25th, there were roughly 60 people combing the desert scrubland to the west and south of Cedar Valley, walking in organized lines through sage and red-tailed hawk territory, their boots raising pale dust with every step. The community response was immediate and genuine. The parking lot of the First Baptist Church of Cedar Valley served as a staging ground. Tables appeared covered in coolers of water, paper bags of sandwiches, sunscreen, and walkie-talkies. People who had known Lori from the school pickup line, from Pioneer Day parades, from the community pool, they all came. They wore hats against the July sun. They moved slowly and carefully through the heat. At the center of it, in the shade of a borrowed canopy tent near the command post, sat Douglas Tanner. Those who were there in those first hours would later describe something that, at the time, they struggled to name. He was cooperative. He answered every question. He did not appear to have been crying. He drank water steadily from a white foam cup and watched the searchers move through the distant brush with an expression that one volunteer, a woman named Sandra Acaffer, who had volunteered with Search and Rescue for 11 years, described years later as waiting. Not anguished, not frantic, waiting. Those who knew him said that Douglas was never a demonstrative man. He wasn't the type to cry in public, his brother-in-law, Ray Falk, would tell investigators in a 2002 interview. That's just how he was raised, and that may have been true. But investigators also noted in their initial reports that when a deputy brought Douglas a cup of coffee on the afternoon of July 25th, the second full day of the search, and told him quietly that they had not yet found any trace of Laurie in the areas they had covered, Douglas Tanner nodded and said, "Thank you for letting me know." The deputy stood for a moment, expecting something more. There was nothing more. Deputies whispered quietly to one another about the made bed, about the shoes, about the car keys on the hook. In every case they had seen or studied where an adult voluntarily left a spouse, left a life, there were traces of preparation. A bag hastily packed, an empty drawer, a missing item of sentimental value. In the Tanner house, nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. The children's lunches were already made in the refrigerator. 2 small brown bags, labeled in Laurie's handwriting, for a day that was now suspended, uncertain. The first significant inconsistency emerged on July 27th, 3 days into the investigation, when lead investigator Dale Forsyth of the Tooele County Sheriff's Office reviewed the odometer reading of Douglas Tanner's white Ford pickup against the records Douglas had provided of his movements on July 23rd. According to Douglas, he had driven the truck to a hardware supply depot in Grantsville that afternoon, a round trip he estimated at 52 miles. The odometer, compared to a reading taken during a routine vehicle inspection 5 days earlier, showed 94 additional miles, 42 miles more than Douglas had accounted for. When investigator Forsyth asked Douglas about this discrepancy during a follow-up interview on July 28th, Douglas was quiet for a long moment, then said he might have made a second stop he had forgotten to mention, a job site to the north, about 20 miles out. He said he often lost track. He said his memory wasn't perfect. Investigator Forsyth documented this in his notes. He wrote, "Subject appears relaxed, makes direct eye contact throughout. Explanation plausible but unverified. Cannot confirm secondary stop with any receipt, witness, or GPS data." This was 2001. Consumer GPS tracking on personal vehicles was not standard. There was no digital trail in the conventional sense. No cell phone location data of meaningful precision. No traffic camera footage on the rural roads outside Cedar Valley. What existed was the land, vast, dry, accommodating, and the absence of evidence, which is not the same as evidence of absence, but can feel very much like it in a small-town investigation with limited resources. The physical search was formally suspended on August 8, 2001, after 16 days. No trace of Laurie Ann Tanner had been found. No body, no clothing, no indication of where she had gone or what had happened to her. The case was officially reclassified as a missing persons investigation, which in 2001 carried with it a particular kind of bureaucratic limbo. Active in name, quiet in practice. The file sitting in a manila folder in a cabinet in the Tooele County Sheriff's Office, while the daily work of a small department moved on around it. Laurie Ann Tanner's photograph was posted in the post office. It was posted in the window of Paulette's Diner. It was sent to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults. The phone rang occasionally with tips that led nowhere. The summers kept coming. The sunflowers in Laurie's garden grew and died and were not replanted. By October of 2001, Douglas Tanner had enrolled Caitlin in 2nd grade at Cedar Valley Elementary and arranged after-school care through a neighbor. By February of 2002, he had placed the pale yellow house on Ridgecrest Avenue on the market. It sold in April. By the summer of 2002, Douglas and the children had relocated to the Salt Lake City suburb of Harriman, roughly 40 miles to the northeast, where Douglas resumed work as a building contractor and enrolled the children in a new school. He told the children's new teachers that their mother had passed away. In the paperwork, he listed himself as the sole guardian. No one in Harriman knew the details of what had happened in Cedar Valley. No one asked. Lori's family, her sister Deborah, her mother Ruth, her father Gerald, who would pass away in 2008 without ever knowing what had happened to his daughter, continued to push. Deborah Marsh, nee Tanner, who lived in Provo, drove to the Tooele County Sheriff's Office in November of 2002 and asked to speak with investigator Forsyth. She brought a handwritten list of things she found troubling: the odometer, the made bed, the shoes. The way Douglas had described Lori's state of mind in the days before she vanished, as a little stressed, a description that Deborah found almost insultingly casual, and that matched nothing of what she knew of her sister's life, her disposition, or any conversation they had shared in the weeks prior. Investigator Forsyth listened. He noted Deborah's concerns carefully. He told her, with the measured honesty of a man who had seen how these cases moved and how they stalled, that without new evidence or a change in circumstances, there was limited action the office could take. Deborah drove back to Provo in the November rain. She did not stop pushing, but pushing against a wall of silence is not the same as moving through it. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, who have sat across from a familiar face and felt, in the space between what was said and what was true, some small cold thing settle into the room. Perhaps you understand something of what the people close to this case describe when they talk about those years. It was not drama. It was not confrontation. It was the slow accumulation of things that didn't quite fit. Things filed away in the mind under a category that has no name but feels, over time, like a weight that doesn't lift. Caitlin Tanner grew. She was 7 when her mother vanished. She was 8 when they moved to Harriman. She was 11 when her father remarried a woman named Greta, whom the children called by her first name and who, by all accounts, tried. She was 14 when she first told a school counselor that she had dreams about her mother, not about the disappearance specifically, about a night, about sounds she remembered and had never entirely made sense of. The counselor made a note. She referred Caitlin to a therapist. The therapist, in 2008, noted in her records that Caitlin described fragmented memories of the night before her mother's disappearance, including hearing her father's truck and the sound of something being moved in the garage around midnight. The therapist noted that these memories were discussed as possible childhood anxiety and were not at that time reported to law enforcement. Caitlin was 14. She did not yet know how to hold what she remembered against what she had been told. Children rarely do. They are taught to trust the adults who shape their world, and that trust is not weakness, it is survival. But trust and truth are not always the same room, and sometimes it takes years to find the door between them. Marcus, who had been 4 years old, remembered almost nothing specific. What he remembered, he described in a later interview as a feeling that the house was different after that summer, a feeling that something had been moved. Children's memories of the years surrounding significant events are geological in nature. They do not record events so much as they record the landscape before and after, the ways in which the earth shifted. In Cedar Valley, the pale yellow house on Ridgecrest Avenue was repainted white by its new owners. The garden was removed and replaced with gravel. Patricia Hallbrook across the street grew older, and sometimes, in the evenings, she thought about the porch light that had been left on. Paulette's diner took down the photograph. The file in the cabinet in the Tooele County Sheriff's Office gathered the specific, granular dust of rural record keeping. Then, in the spring of 2019, investigator Dale Forsyth retired. And before he did, he handed a box of materials to a younger investigator named Melissa Chow, 38, who had joined the office in 2014 and who had developed a habit, which she described later in an interview with a Salt Lake Tribune journalist, of reviewing cold case files when her active caseload allowed. Forsyth told her on the day he cleaned out his desk, "That one always bothered me. The shoes. The shoes, the car keys on the hook, the made bed, the 42 unaccounted miles." Investigator Chow took the box home. It began, as so many things do, with a phone call no one was expecting. On March 11, 2022, investigator Melissa Chow received a call at the Tuil County Sheriff's Office from a woman who identified herself as Caitlin Marsh, formerly Caitlin Tanner, who had taken her maternal grandmother's married name after a legal name change in 2018. She was now 28 years old. She was living in Denver, Colorado, where she worked as a pediatric occupational therapist. She had recently entered a new course of trauma-focused therapy following the birth of her first child. She told investigator Chow that she needed to report something she had never formally reported to law enforcement. She said she had been building toward this call for years. She said she had things to say that she believed were relevant to the case of her mother's disappearance. The call lasted 1 hour and 47 minutes. Investigator Chow took 11 pages of handwritten notes and recorded the conversation with Caitlin's consent. In the weeks that followed, Chow requested and received those 2008 therapy records. She contacted Deborah Marsh, now 54, who had never stopped waiting for exactly this kind of call. She petitioned the Tuil County Attorney's Office to formally reopen the case. The petition was approved on April 4, 2022. What Caitlin told investigators in the formal interview conducted on April 19, 2022 at the Tuil County Sheriff's Office was methodical and specific. 21 years had passed, but memory, particularly trauma memory, does not always fade in the ways we expect it to. Sometimes it crystallizes, sometimes it waits. She said, "I was 7, I know I was 7. I remember waking up that night because I heard the truck, my dad's truck. It had a sound, a specific sound in the engine, kind of like a rattle, and I knew it. I knew what his truck sounded like. It was dark. I don't know what time. I went to the window and the truck wasn't in the driveway, and then, after a while, it was back in the driveway, and then the garage door opened and then it closed, and I heard something on the garage floor, like something being slid. And then I went back to bed. I told myself it was a dream, but it wasn't a dream. I know the difference now." She said, "I want to be clear, I didn't see anything. I didn't see my dad. I didn't see my mom. I heard the truck. I heard the garage. I am telling you what I heard. I have told the truth my whole life, and I am telling the truth now." Investigator Chow, working with the Tuil County Attorney's Office and the Utah Department of Criminal Investigation, also located a new witness. A long-haul truck driver named Glenn Abernethy, who had been traveling the rural road between Cedar Valley and the Desert Basin area known as Skull Valley on the night of July 23, 2001, and who, in a statement he had given once in 2001 to Cedar Valley deputies and then never been recontacted, had described seeing a white pickup truck parked on the side of the road near a dry wash at approximately 11:45 p.m. He had thought nothing of it at the time. In 2022, when investigator Chow tracked him down at his home in Elko, Nevada, and showed him the original 2001 statement he had given, he confirmed every detail. He remembered because the truck had its hazard lights on, which was unusual. He remembered because there was no reason for a truck to be parked in that location at that hour. He had not thought of it again until the investigator sat across from him with a manila folder and the specific, quiet wait of 21 years. The road in question ran approximately 22 miles from Cedar Valley. Round trip, 44 miles, within 2 miles of the unaccounted odometer discrepancy. Clears throat. On May 3, 2022, investigators in coordination with the Utah Department of Criminal Investigation conducted a ground search of the Skull Valley Wash area, using both cadaver-trained dogs and ground-penetrating radar technology that had not existed in 2001. The search focused on a half-mile radius around the location described by Abernethy. On May 6, the 4th day of the search, the cadaver dogs alerted to an area of disturbed soil beneath a shallow shelf of sandstone. On May 8, 2022, following the careful excavation of that site, medical examiner Dr. Patricia Yee of the Utah Office of the Medical Examiner confirmed the recovery of skeletal remains consistent with a woman of approximately Lori Ann Tanner's age, height, and build. DNA analysis, requested on an expedited basis, confirmed the identification on June 2, 2022. Lori Ann Tanner had never left Cedar Valley voluntarily. She had never walked out in the dark. She had been there, in the dry earth beneath the sandstone shelf, for 21 years, within 22 miles of the house on Ridgecrest Avenue, 22 miles from the sunflowers that had bloomed and died. Douglas Tanner was arrested on June 14, 2022, at his residence in Harriman, Utah. He was 65 years old. He was retired. He was, by the accounts of his neighbors in Harriman, a quiet man who kept his lawn trimmed and drove a newer white pickup and occasionally attended community events. He had been married to Greta for 11 years. He had never, in 21 years, been charged with anything. 2 Tooele County Sheriff's deputies and 2 agents from the Utah Department of Criminal Investigation made the arrest at 8:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Douglas Tanner was standing in his kitchen when they knocked. He opened the door. He looked at the 4 people standing on his porch and, according to the arresting deputies, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll get my shoes." He was charged with 1 count of first-degree criminal homicide. Bond was denied. He was remanded to the Tooele County Jail pending arraignment. The news broke that afternoon. By evening, the story had been picked up by the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, and National Wire services. The headlines used words like cold case, 21 years, community stunned. People who had known Douglas Tanner in Harriman gave interviews to local television stations in which they said they were shocked. Some said they had never seen anything alarming in him. A few said more quietly that they weren't entirely surprised, that there had always been something, a stillness behind his eyes, a quality of absence in moments when presence was expected, that they had never quite named. In Cedar Valley, Patricia Hallbrook, now 83 and still living on Ridgecrest Avenue, learned the news from her granddaughter who called from Salt Lake City. Patricia sat in her armchair for a long time. She thought about the porch light. She thought about Lori Ann Tanner walking her children to the pool on a July afternoon, the 3 of them moving in the easy way of a family that has nothing to hide from the afternoon. She thought about the things you notice and then decide mean nothing. She thought about the cost of that decision, measured in years. Deborah Marsh in Provo had already received the call from investigator Chow before the news broke publicly. She had sat in her kitchen with her husband and her grown sons and said, with the exhausted clarity of someone who has been carrying a certainty without proof for 2 decades, "I knew. I always knew. I just didn't know how to prove it." At the arraignment hearing on June 28, 2022, in the Tooele County District Court, Douglas Tanner entered a plea of not guilty. He stood at the defendant's table in a gray suit that someone, presumably his attorney, had brought for him. He held his hands clasped in front of him on the table. He looked straight ahead. Those in the courtroom that day described his expression as one they had difficulty articulating, not fear exactly, not defiance, something more opaque than either. The face of a man who had spent 21 years maintaining a particular composure and had not yet decided to stop. Caitlin Marsh attended the arraignment. She sat in the gallery with her Aunt Deborah on one side and her own therapist on the other. She wore a gray blazer and kept her hands folded in her lap. When Douglas Tanner was led into the courtroom, she looked at her father directly. He did not look at the gallery. Caitlin later told a journalist, "I wasn't there for him. I was there for my mother. I wanted someone in that room to be there for her." Preliminary hearings were scheduled through the autumn of 2022. In the months that followed, the prosecution's case was built methodically. The DNA identification of Lori's remains, the odometer records, the witness testimony of Glenn Abernethy, the forensic analysis of the burial site, including evidence of tools consistent with those found in Douglas Tanner's possession during an earlier authorized search of a storage unit in his name in 2022. The medical examiner's report listed the probable cause of death as undetermined pending additional forensic review, but consistent with trauma, a detail that, in the language of forensic documentation, said everything it needed to say. In November of 2022, faced with the totality of the accumulated evidence and following negotiations with the Tooele County Attorney's Office, Douglas Tanner changed his plea to guilty on one count of criminal homicide. Sentencing was scheduled for March of 2023. On March 15, 2023, Douglas Tanner was sentenced to 15 years to life in the Utah State Correctional Facility. Under Utah sentencing guidelines, he would be eligible for a parole hearing after serving a minimum term. The judge presiding over the hearing, the Honorable Sandra Kimura, said in her remarks before sentencing, "This court has before it a case of profound, sustained harm to a woman who deserved to come home to her children, and harm to children who deserve to grow up knowing the truth about their mother's fate. The length of concealment in this case represents not only a crime against the victim, but a sustained violation of the community's trust in those who live within it." When the sentence was read, Caitlin Marsh was given the opportunity to speak as a family representative. She stood at the podium in the courtroom. She had prepared a written statement. She held it in both hands, and then she put it down on the podium, and she spoke without it. She said, "My mother grew sunflowers. She grew tomatoes and basil, and she was teaching me how to garden. She made our lunches the night before so she wouldn't have to rush in the morning. She braided her hair when she worked in the garden. She was 31 years old, and she was kind, and she was present, and she was real, and she deserved to be found." She said, "I don't need anything from you. I'm not here to ask for remorse or explanation. I'm here because she couldn't be. I'm here because someone has to say her name in this room. Lori Ann Tanner, my mother, that's all." She sat down. The courtroom was quiet in the specific way of rooms where something true has just been spoken aloud. What does it mean when the truth arrives 21 years late? There is no clean answer. The institutions designed to find it tried, within the limits of their time and their resources, and still it slipped through. One retired investigator handed a box to a younger one. One child grew old enough to understand what she had heard in the dark. One long-haul truck driver confirmed, 2 decades later, what he had seen and never been asked about again. Truth is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is accumulative. A made bed, a pair of shoes by the door, an odometer reading in a manila folder in a rural office cabinet, a child at a window in the dark, hearing a truck engine with the particular rattle she knew and would remember. All of it sitting quietly for years, waiting for someone to hold all the pieces at the same time in the same light. Lori Ann Tanner was 31 years old. She had brown hair and gray-blue eyes and sunflowers in her garden that bloomed on the last ordinary morning of her children's ordinary lives. She made lunches the night before. She walked her children to the pool in the summer heat. She was real, and she was present, and she was loved, and she was found. Some cases close. Some cases simply become true.